Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, good morning.
I've been there with glaciers.
I know we're all really excited to talk about affordable housing investment strategy. I was trying to give everybody a few more minutes to join us. I know there's a few people missing, but we just gotta get going. We have a lot to cover today. Again, we have our amazing team from HRNA Advisors joining us remotely. And they will really be the ones presenting to you today. For the final stage, if you will, of this strategic plan. They'll specifically be talking about the final strategies that we will be including in the plan, and also a little bit more on the implementation side of things and how we can actually get this going. It's not just ideas. Again, it was about a little bit more on the implementation side of things. And then when they wrap up, we'll just share some of the highlights of our upcoming public input campaign, if you will. We have a lot of opportunities. There's a flyer at your seats. We've got community events and so on. And so we'll talk about that. That's also really important, right? We want your input as well as the community. So again, if you have questions about the plan, maybe we can wait until the end, HRNA, if that works, so we can get through everything, or would you rather questions as we go through?
When we're not there, it'd be better for us to actually get the questions while we're doing it, so we can make this as much as a conversation as we can. We're happy to have questions at the end, but you know, okay. Your point that we want this to be discussion, we want to get feedback, we want to revise, we want to make this, you know, implementable is the key focus here for us.
Okay, perfect. So we'll keep it conversational. So just jump in if you've got comments or questions. This is not your last time, but you'll have a chance to give us comments either.
Speaker for them is apparently only on this one behind me, and maybe it's on that one behind the folks there.
Cameron, do
But
you?
it's a little hard to hear. I get a chance putting it up front.
Cameron's our expert with the tech stuff in this room.
Just, you know, to turn the volume on the front screen, I know.
Thank you. And in the meantime, I don't believe everybody has had a chance to meet our new director at Housing and Community Development.
Good morning, everyone.
I'm sure he will be making the rounds, introducing himself directly. But without further ado, I'll pass it over. I don't think we have Form 5 yet, so I'm going to hold off on the voting for the April 4th meeting minutes until the end. Oh, yeah, more trickling in. HRNA, it's all yours. I will let you share your screen.
All right, just one moment and we'll pull up presentation. So I think I met almost everyone, but for those who I haven't, I'm Philip Cash, I'm a partner at HRNA. I'm out of our DC office. I lead HRNA's housing practice. And we are going to go through, as Alejandro was saying, we're going to go through a draft set of recommendations for the strategy. And then, you know, from there, move into a process of revising and finalizing and adopting the strategy. So next slide. So recommendations and discussion, although definitely welcoming discussion as we're going through the recommendations. Want to make sure we're being clear, putting nuance on things, and you know, hearing from you all about background or considerations we should keep in mind. Next slide. So we started meeting back in December with an initial approach. This is our 4th meeting. The previous meeting, in February, we met, we talked about market conditions, talked about the challenges we're facing, which we'll recap at a very high level here. But for those of you who don't have it, there's a full version of that presentation and that background on the challenges your market's facing. In April, we had a conversation about potential housing tools. So which strategies, which approaches might actually make sense in Athens, given your challenges, given your priorities, given local capacity. We got a lot of useful feedback about, you know, what's been tried in the past and what isn't, you know, where there are barriers, what's already moving forward, and how to coordinate with other efforts, and where there's capacity or desire to build capacity. And we tried to incorporate that into what we're going through today, but again, want to continue to get feedback. Going forward, we're going, you know, as Alejandro was saying, we're going to get into a public comment process. So, you know, large community meetings, posting this plan up on a website, taking back written comments. You all, you know, we're going to be taking notes on your comments during this meeting. There's also, you know, we welcome written comments. Those are always not always, usually much clearer, and make sure we don't miss anything, key points, and we want to make sure we're getting that in here. And then finally, looking in September to actually adopt the housing investment strategy. So, previous meeting, we started talking about tools. Our approach to this is always about, are the tools aligned with the priorities of the community and the challenges in the community? How feasible are they? Are these things that can actually be done given capacity, given local law, given available resources? If we were actually able to execute them, would they have a meaningful impact on this? Is this the most efficient use of public dollars? Is this the most efficient use of staff time? And then implementate, like, to actually launch these. Anytime we create something new or adjust something that takes a fair amount of work, how long will it take? How complex is it? Is this a reasonable thing for us to actually be able to execute and pull off on? So we try to think about those questions as we go through and make recommendations. We'll see some of that in the presentation today, and appreciate the comments, frankly, the feedback you all gave us in meeting number 3, previous meeting. Next slide. Can everyone hear me all right? I know there was a comment about not being able to hear me. Can you go back a slide?
Yes.
Great. I assumed you could, but realize that sometimes someone can drone on. Okay, we're losing slides here. Can we go to the slide about the market conditions? Next slide. All right, in just one moment, we'll pull up a slide that talks about our market condition at a high level. As I said, there's a more detailed version of this market condition analysis that we've gone through previously, but there are a couple key challenges that we've really anchored our recommendations around and the strategies around. Can we go to the next slide? And we really anchored our recommendations and our strategies around. Looks like we cannot go to the next slide.
You can start unsharing your screen and sharing it again. Am I reset it?
Sorry, I'm from a dual monitor and it's like freezing up right now.
I can share screen, that's fine. It's working?
Yep, perfect. So as I was saying, we were looking at market conditions. We have a more detailed version, but there are 3 core areas that we really focus on. One is just, there is public funding. There's been more public funding with additional federal funding over the recent years. But the level of local public funding is limited. So you have about $1.7 million annually, which isn't nothing, but it's not a huge amount of money, but that's almost entirely coming from federal sources. So how to grow capacity, to produce at a higher level, to achieve any of the goals we're talking about, this is a Athens housing investment strategy. In order to invest, there has to be additional resources to invest. And that, frankly, we see as the core fundamental underlying challenge here. Then within that, there's a lack of quality, affordable rental homes. So that's both the challenge in the market conditions as overall, and the existing market rate affordable housing, and the conditions of that housing, and frankly, the production of subsidized rental homes. It's been pretty limited, and that's tied both to points related to state policy around low-income housing tax credit, but also the availability of local funding and capacity to execute development. And then challenges of affordable home ownership. So the home ownership rate in Athens-Clarke County is lower than the state. It has been lower than the state. It's trending downward, not upward. And so how that can be addressed, that's a set of a core challenge here. So these 3 challenges of limited public funding, a decreasing supply of affordable rental homes, and low home ownership rates that are not climbing are really the 3 points when we look at the market that the investment strategy is organized around. Next slide. So with those challenges in mind, we really built goals directly related to them. So if we have limited public capacity and limited funding, how do we identify an ongoing local public funding? Now, this is challenging. We got into some pretty good conversation about this last time, or I imagine we're gonna have some more conversation about today. State of Georgia does not make this easy. And so we'll talk about that, but this is fundamental. All housing policies and programs are fundamentally public-private partnerships. There is a private developer, there is a nonprofit running the program and doing the outreach. There's very few areas where the public sector is doing things entirely on their own. And even when they are, they need public money to do it. So the ability to drive additional resources into the source and identify an ongoing, because it's an ongoing challenge, is, we see as one of the key, most fundamental pieces. Basically, really have to scale up the capacity here to be equal to the scale of challenge. Then on the affordable rental home side, the aspirational goal here needs to be, the number of affordable rental homes has been declining, and how we turn the curve on that. So we actually start to preserve some of our existing rental homes in Athens-Clarke County and start to increase the rate of production and use that to both increase affordability, but also take some of the displacement pressure off of existing residents. And then the last area, as a goal, is the other side of homeownership. So expanding access to homeownership, making sure households who are currently renters have the ability to pursue homeownership and achieve homeownership, and then protecting existing homeowners. You have existing homeowners who are in place who have lower incomes and are struggling on fixed incomes. And so really trying to adjust it. So these are the three goals that are really the inverse of the challenges that we've organized things around. Next slide. So we've talked about this in some of our previous presentations. Create an affordable, create a housing market that works for all residents, a market that's affordable and equitable. You really need a comprehensive approach. You need strong land use regulations that allow for the creation of homes in response to market pressure. You need to try to take some of that market pressure and use it to create affordable homes. You need to take public money and help use that public money to leverage up private and philanthropic money to close the gap between what households at lower incomes can afford and what it costs to build and operate homes. And then you need tenants' rights that balance the interests of tenants and property owners, because they have two different sets of interests there. And for one side, the tenant side, that is, it's not just a business transaction, it's also their home. The recommendations we're putting forward here are more heavily indexed, more heavily skewed towards the subsidy section. And that's partially because the scope of the work was about an investment strategy. It's also because of, constraints in Georgia law. There's not a lot, or not as nearly as much as you can do on land use as you can do in other places. And tenants' rights are extremely curtailed. So both because the focus of the original plan was on subsidy and because of the conditions in your state, the focus of these sets of recommendations is much more on subsidy. We acknowledge that a broader, more comprehensive approach is important, and we do talk about some of the other tools, but there's a heavier focus on the subsidy tools. Next slide. So it's great to make recommendations. Lots of plans make recommendations, and you'll see in the full version of the plan, which you will all get to read through, that we put forward a lot of recommendations. There'll be a lot of different things to do. Those recommendations can really only be effective if there's actual capacity to execute them. So we've tried to organize them around the goals, so there's a clear connection, a clear through line, but also try to identify which of those prioritize. So actually what's going to get implemented when and how that's going to get implemented. We're going to go through some of these at a higher level and get a little bit deeper into what the recommendations are for some of the key priority recommendations. Next slide. So in terms of what's going on right now, Athens-Clarke County is actually already in the process. It's already doing work, making changes to its down payment assistance program, increasing the level of funding, changing how that program works to make it more effective. The same thing on the owner-occupied repair side. So making sure that the program has, looking at the level of funding that's put out there and how you reach households. So those are things that are in process that the plan's recommending, but we also want to acknowledge that are already moving on. There's a set of priorities we're putting in the near term. The first is creating a local housing fund. Next is supporting LIHTC development, and that's GAP money, but it's also other things beyond GAP money. It's changing your development approval processes, trying to bring in developers, but trying to make it more effective. It's looking at, you have an inclusionary zoning policy that you put in place. That's an important step. Making sure to monitor that and assess it and make adjustments as needed. You passed the policy and the market changed on you in a pretty major way after you passed the policy. And so, understanding that and making tweaks where they need to be made. And then looking at a acquisition strike fund. Strike fund, we mean here, is a tool to grab properties that come up on the market, particularly rental properties and get them under control through a nonprofit or for-profit partner with a mission focus to protect the quality and protect the affordability here, since a lot of your challenges around losing your existing market rate affordable. We're going to go through these. You'll see those little dotted lines. We see the local housing fund really as the foundation for almost all of this work. So it's how you'd have more money to continue to expand and sustain your down payment assistance. It's how you'd be able to grow your owner occupied rehab. It's how you'd actually have additional support for light tech development. Frankly, it'll probably be the source for your initial capitalization for an acquisition strike fund. So we see it as a, not to overemphasize or overindex, but we see it as the foundational piece for you all to move forward. And frankly, one of the biggest challenges you faced is this is something you all have looked at previously, and we know that. Next slide. So I'm going to stop there and start to get into some of the recommendations in greater detail. I know I can talk fast and cover a lot of points. Anything before I jump in? Is there any comments? There'll be more opportunities, but want to make sure I'm just not plowing over questions or things that were unclear or poorly described. We'll take that as everyone completely understands and is extremely excited, and we'll move on to the next section. So, identifying ongoing local public funding. I'm going to talk about the local housing fund, but there's also a piece in here about public land disposition. There's other tools, but primarily we're going to focus on the local housing fund. Next slide. So we've talked about this previously. There are some large projects in the works, but it's been hard to sustain significant affordable housing development in Athens-Clarke County because there's just not, home funding, CDBG funding, federal funding doesn't go that far. Next slide. So there are challenges in Georgia law, and I am not a lawyer, and I'm going to try to say things mostly accurately. And I know there are people with expertise in this in the room, and I welcome and invite folks into the conversation. You can't dedicate funding to, and this is described in much more detail in the plan. Under Georgia law, you can't dedicate funding to a whole bunch of things. The Constitution of Georgia is pretty constrained on this. It's interesting to read about why and how that was linked to the Great Depression and Civil War. That's an interesting history, but not necessarily our primary focus here. What you can do, but there is funding that you can allocate, and you have to allocate on an annual basis, on a regular basis. You can't have it committed on an ongoing basis, but local governments do have the ability to allocate their funding to use for affordable housing. So it's not that you can't use anything for affordable housing. It's just that you can't do what many places in the country do of, we're going to have a dedicated property transfer fee, or we're going to rate property taxes by a penny and we're going to dedicate that penny to affordable housing, or we're going to tax short-term rentals, Airbnb, and we're going to allocate it over here, or our good friends in New York, we're going to legalize marijuana and tax that for affordable housing. Those are all great places to get affordable housing funding from. You can use, within the legality, almost any of those sources, but you couldn't dedicate it just the same way that other places can. So there's a couple areas, and we lay all this out in much more detail, and happy to discuss it here in the plan, but there are a set of options for how you're going to come at this. And what we're recommending is that you start to explore. We are not saying exactly the right source, but we are recommending these are sources that are possible. You start to explore their legality, the other legal constraints within Georgia law, the scale, so how much funding we can really put on the table here, and frankly, stability. So are these funding sources to be one-time or ongoing? We're really pushing you towards ongoing because you have an ongoing challenge, and frankly, as we said before, everything is a public-private partnership. So your nonprofit, including your for-profit partners, they need to have some sense that this is going to be an ongoing source of funding, so they can build their business plan, build their capacity, hire their staff, train folks up on the idea that this is the thing they're going to be doing on more than a one-off basis. So talking a little bit more deeply about some of the sources, there's an option of just going to your general funds and taking a point of existing general revenue and allocating it to housing. So saying we're going to use, you could allocate it on a project by project basis. You can allocate it in a designated account that says we're going to spend $5 million on affordable housing this year, and here are the rules for how that's going to get spent. But just general tax dollars. There's also the ability to try to create new sources, and this is We get into more detail on what some of the potential new sources are, but there is the ability to dedicate new sources, and this might be raising a tax or levying a new tax or fee, and then having that amount of money, whatever that new tax or fee is, allocated each year over, not dedicated, but actually allocated through a budgeting process each year over. Obviously the downside to that is raising taxes or putting new fees in place is generally not terribly popular with those who will be paying for it. We also think from the community conversations we've had and from what we're hearing from you all is like affordable housing is a public priority. And if the benefits are clearly articulated, this might be something that we could, the council could get behind and the public could get behind. There's also looking at, not non-tax, non-tax based revenue. So looking at specific challenges there about not tax sources, but actual, one-time sources for selling property or otherwise, but other revenue sources that come in. There's an approach for tax allocation districts. So for those who aren't familiar, that's incremental financing. You have some tax allocation districts in Athens-Clarke County. Other jurisdictions in the country use this. Other jurisdictions in Georgia use this. So I think the most famous in Georgia is the Beltline tax allocation districts in Atlanta, which have dedicated a significant amount of funding to affordable housing. I think there's some lessons learned about how they actually deploy that money to create affordable homes because they haven't been so strong there, but they have raised a lot of money. They just haven't always been so strong at getting that money out the door. There's challenges with tax allocation districts. They're complicated to create. When you create them, there's other uses you need to address besides affordable housing, and there has to be real incremental increase in value for there actually to be revenue. And then there are geographic limits on where you're going to use it. There's some flexibility on those geographic limits, but there's and the last area is like, if you create a fund, you also want to look at where we can pull in, philanthropic sources or, private market capital that can be granted over for mission-based purposes. So I don't mean these as all of the sources, but these are some of, we do believe there are sources that are viable, and what we're pushing for is for Athens-Clarke County to focus on and explore how much funding these different sources could generate, the legality, the legal constraints on creating new fees or taxes, because there are some of them that can be allowed, but there are constraints on that, and the reoccurrence and the scale that they could actually get into. Next slide. So, and this is all laid out in more detail in the actual housing plan. Standing up and creating a local housing fund is the core challenge. Is first thinking about funding availability, but there is a lot to making these local housing funds actually work. It's not just having the money, it's how you assess things, how you deploy them, how you get community organized around the priorities in them. So where we're at right now is we're in the strategic planning process. So the strategic plan was adopted and council supported the idea of exploring a local housing fund. That's really kind of the first step here. From there, the next step would be getting into a more detailed analysis of the potential funding sources. From when you had a set of recommendations specific about what the budget implications were and what the approach would be for those funding sources, that is something you need to take back to your council, receive authorization either at council or at the manager level, depending on the approach. Almost very likely it's going to be a council. From there, you're going to want to develop, you're going to want to put a board in place or some kind of advisory committee, and you're going to have bylaws. This is really the place where you start to set priorities, for the funding. So half of the money is going to go to households at less than 50% of area median income. We want to make sure we're spending a third of the money on home ownership. We want to prioritize reinvestment and revitalization in these neighborhoods. We want to ensure that we're working with local organizations so that we're building capacity with this funding as well. We want to make sure we're thinking about equity and inclusion in our tenant selection or our hiring processes. That really happens. That's one of the next steps in the process. And we begin for each of these, we've put forward in the plan a more detailed set of recommendations of how we think you would approach each of these steps and some initial recommendations about how that board would be established, what their function would be, what some of those priorities would be, to give you some guidance to go ahead. The next is making sure you have a competitive application process. You have competitive allocation processes for home and other funding. It's really about taking out federal restrictions where you can and streamlining those processes and making them attractive to try to draw in additional capacity. So building the capacity of your existing organizations or getting new organizations to form or organizations from outside the community to come in and participate. And then, We say this is probably takes about a year, but by the end of the year, the idea of launching the fund and actually starting to deploy capital. Next slide. So depending on the rules and allocations you set, and depending on how much money you allocated in here, we're potentially talking about tripling about where your annual production is right now. You're about 50 homes you're touching each year right now in Athens-Clarke County. If if you got up to about $5 million in local housing fund, which, that's about $3 million in additional local money each year. When we look at the numbers and have conversation, the idea of tripling the funding is appropriate. Next slide. So we can go back a slide. So I laid a lot on the local housing fund. We got a lot of feedback from you all previously on this. There's much more detail in the plan, so I'm sure we'll get some of these comments in writing as you get a chance to read through everything, but would appreciate feedback or comments or thoughts on this. So I've laid it out initially.
Philip, this is Kelly Gertz. Good to see you. This might be a question for the group, but just thinking about the kind of volume of financing going on an annual basis, we're thinking somewhere in the ballpark of $5 billion a year. That would equate to a little bit less than a mil. We're thinking in terms of property tax, or a little bit less than a quarter of a penny if we're thinking in terms of sales tax. I'm curious, just to ask the group at the table, do you think from a public palatability standpoint, one of those or the other would be more positively perceived by the fine folks at Athens-Clarke County?
Well, we always want the students to help us pay. So presumably they would if we raise the property taxes, because that money can be passed on to them and increases. But I think just from a public perception point of view, a quarter of a penny might sound better because everybody pays it, even though it's actually the most aggressive kind of taxation we can have. But that's my 2 cents. That's my quarter penny right there.
And we're gonna do a quick switch over of the computer since that one wants to restart its own. So just bear with us 1 second.
And just to kind of briefly mention what mechanisms some other local governments have used for funding generally, not directed toward housing, but just generally. Some governments, Macon and Columbus, or 2 unified governments in the state, that use an OLOST, other local option sales tax, which is another of that litany of kinds of losts. We would likely have to generate some approval to do that, but that's at least bubbling in my mind as a phenomenon. And it could be, a fractional piece of a penny.
Well, the nice thing about any kind of loss, just keep it, not put first initial in there, is that about 50% of it's paid by folks outside the county. That becomes a selling point. Trying to sell it to,
Yeah. And these days, a penny of any of this loss is about $30 million a year.
Yeah. The difference, of course, is that I assume is that takes a vote of the entire populace, correct?
That's right.
Versus, I assume the commission can do a mill. So you got to ask yourself the cost and the run up and the explanation and the campaign for doing a penny or a fraction of a penny versus the mill.
Quote Clint Eastwood, are you feeling lucky?
Yeah, that's right. That requires much better triangulation on at least to me, on the populace than a change to the budget.
I'm probably not the only person in this room who served on a SPOS committee, so when you do, one of your jobs is to actually run the campaign for it after it the projects are selected. the advantage that we have here is the work that's happening right now with this plan. So if whichever way we go, we'll be able to show, citizens pretty clearly how this money's going to be spent. I think that, I can imagine people saying, I'm not going to spend a quarter of a penny because they're going to build, projects in my backyard or something like that. So having a more specific plan, I think will help sell it either way, but, I don't know. I guess it depends on how lucky you deal. Kelly's term limited, so he doesn't really have to think about it.
Yeah.
Re-election.
Let it all hang out.
You spoke to SWAT committees to do a lot of the work of, helping the public understand why it's a good idea. We have this committee here. I assume there will be other people continuing to do work once this report is accepted. Maybe it's our job to tell the public the story of why this is a worthwhile investment. Village rate is much more within our control, in terms of state government approval or anything like that. And in my mind, it also is a bit more logical in terms of who's paying it and who's benefiting. We're talking about homeowners essentially paying that tax, but then property owners, and it's to benefit people owning property. So it's, kind of a social safety net in that way for people who already own property here. In terms of what's going to be palatable for the public, I think we can play a
We lost them. Can you hear us?
Yeah, we lost them.
Well, they'll be back in a minute, and they might be able to hear us right now. So this is good conversation, and I think we can incorporate some of those considerations about votes and outreach, and to make sure we get those incorporated in the draft, because they're right. The path is a complicated path.
It would not be a broad-based use of funds. Normally, a SPOS project is broad-based use of funds, and you're trying to use all the different uses of the funds across the community. I'm assuming that you go with a loss process, in this case, this is for housing, period, budget into the mix, because if you open that up, then yeah, everybody's gonna be the same. And that process is gonna sort of grind it down well.
Let me interject something. Formation and implementation. That's a scenario with 5 years from now, 3 years from now. How do we kind of manage that? One of the thought along the way is actually didn't have to figure out. Way to the point the bottom line was never executed.
So we can't hear you. I hope you can hear us.
Hang on one second, Attorney.
I can hear you now. I can
Oh,
hear
one
you.
second. I want to make sure that they can hear everything, and we're having clearly technical issues.
It's
1 second, please.
flexible. We got lots of time, and this is, from our viewpoint, the local housing fund is the most important.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I appreciate you bringing that up, Roderick, because, I've watched the evolution of that line from people from Ryan Gravel's grad student to, and the most recent book, critical of the way that that's rolled on. And, so remaining having village dedication could be as early as next July 1st, the beginning of the next fiscal year. Agent and people will approve. Members were to form a referendum in November. That would be basically January 1 of 25. So those would be the two most optimistic dates for this.
Yeah, there's one other interesting wrinkle in this to think about as I've sat here and processed it. Having been on the school's boss as well as, you know, Kelly, and that number sort of gets set. And yes, sales go up, but not massively. Generally, they're pretty stable over whatever period of time, 5 to 10 years, you know, et cetera. While none of us like mills, the nice thing about mills is they probably keep up with inflation a little bit better in some ways, I think, than, you know, a situation does.
Historical trajectory, if you look at the sales, the property tax, that we have seen a
Big jump.
pretty jump in.
Part of that, I think, was, yeah, but part of our big jump was a couple of years ago when online sales kicked in. Then you saw a really big increase in sales tax.
Because we've been riding on about $22 billion a year for a while. And
yeah, it stays fairly stable, whereas I think you have a more steady upward progression. You're looking for, you know, long-term and how the things play out long-term. That's something to think about, is which one's going to result in a better sort of steady upward movement. Because housing costs don't go down. It also ties to the housing costs. You know, if you got a mill, it's getting tied to housing costs, not inflation overall. Housing costs lately have really gone up.
Yeah.
So you get a year in which sales tax isn't going up, but housing costs are going up, then what you can do with the proceeds goes down. Unless your proceeds are tracking along with your housing costs. So just something to think about in there. I'm not married either. Anything would be great.
yeah,
You know, I'm not arguing particularly for one thing or another. I'm just saying, think about some of these factors as we move forward.
yeah, that would definitely, just given the urgency of the situation we're in, like spend it all behind. As soon as I read the draft report, when Alejandro sent it out, I immediately began to go, okay, what's our source?
Well, I don't know, maybe is it worth having that as part of the discussion as well? Because, I mean, I keep balancing these things in my mind that if it's a property tax, and of course, UGA doesn't pay anything. So people might feel, I work with a bunch of economists, not one myself, but the sort of one of the principles about taxation is that the tax should be borne by the people who benefit the most. And you can make an argument that, you know, the UGA is student population is a big enough part of the problem that they should help. So I guess I personally would prefer the millage increase because it's clean, it's, you know, it's very local, but I just think maybe it might be good to get some ideas outside of this room on that question.
Yeah, I think that's right, but be percolating, if everyone would. Yeah.
Let me say this, from where I usually sit, I'm concerned about the impact on low wealth property owners, elderly property owners. And so I think to be clear about which of the two would be better for them. Because we try to create ownership. In fact, we might be doing the opposite in some populations. So just beg you to please be mindful of that as we go through this process.
That's helpful, Mr. Smith. And one of the phenomena with lost taxes is that they all have different exemptions. So you can clarify, food, diapers, et cetera, exempted, and that's an opportunity, just as we think about all of the impacts.
Are we ready?
Yeah, it's working now. They can hear us, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, y'all kept talking, so they
Go ahead.
kept listening. This is gonna be great.
All right.
No, this is, we're gonna try to get some of this recorded in terms of the steps and the options in the plan. We have some of it written in there already. But I just thinking about the steps right here, like, as I go back forward one more slide. I think is what we're, forward one more slide. No, not back, forward.
Austin, I can share. I think you're still having trouble.
All right, doesn't matter. In terms of the steps, slide 15. In terms of the steps, I think like what we're recommending is exactly what you all are talking about is how do we get together and dig deeper on how much money we could get, where it would come from, exactly the steps it takes to get there. And, lay off those trade-offs. It's like the identifying revenue sources, you all have thought about this before. You have a good sense of the numbers right now. You're able to rattle off generally the right volume of numbers. I think it really comes down to like dialing in on what the strategy is and then trying to move that strategy, which frankly, you all have thought about this for a while and are pretty far along in thinking it's like reaching agreement on which approach you're going to pursue. At least that's how we hear it and that's what we've seen so far. And certainly welcome written feedback and additional adjustments, but we're going to try to get that pretty clearly into the plan. If there are no more comments in this section, we're going to talk about other tools because the local housing fund is foundational, but there are other things that need to be done.
Awesome. Thanks, Philip. And thanks everyone for the discussion around the local housing fund. As Philip mentioned, moving on to the next set of tools, and they relate to the building and preservation of quality affordable rental homes. We're going to talk through 3 tools here. Oh, wait, you didn't hear any of that. I was on mute.
No, it only muted for just a second.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I was saying, moving on to the next set of tools around building and preserving.
You're dropping out, Judy. You're breaking up and dropping out. We're hearing a part of what you're saying, then it'll stop and then you'll pick back up again.
Is it better now, Rick? I'm holding my mic
Yeah,
closer.
we can hear you now, but I just wanted you to know that was going on. I don't know if that's a microphone problem on your end or maybe a streaming problem.
Okay, thanks. I think it's a microphone problem. But if it's fine now, am I still breaking up? All okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, great. So talking about the tools around building and preserving affordable rental homes, we want to talk about 3 key tools. As you saw, there's a longer list, but really again, in terms of prioritizing and what are the tools to move on in the near term is these 3, the first of which is supporting LIHTC development. Of course, gap financing is the key part there, but there's also other support that ACC Gov can provide to support LIHTC development. The second, talking about your existing voluntary inclusionary zoning policy and how that could be calibrated to increase the number of affordable homes being produced. And then finally, the acquisition strike fund, which relates to the preservation of existing affordable rental homes that some of which are being lost to market pressures. So speaking about the first one, about supporting LIHTC checks, these are the steps that we are laying out in terms of implementation. And like I said, the first one is providing gap financing through the local housing fund. Of course, HCD has been providing gap financing using primarily home dollars up until now, but providing more money and leveraging it to attract more capital to increase LIHTC development. That's really the first step, and then developing that annual competitive process to make sure that it keeps going on. This next two steps really have to do with on the planning side. What we heard from you all was, there should be alignment between development approval processes and light allocation cycles. So there'll need to be some collaboration between developers and between planning to identify, what are some of these hurdles, how can they be improved, whether it's development approval timelines or other zoning barriers. And the next one that we're talking about here that we're recommending is we've had some conversations about leveraging public land. Looking at the inventory of public land, there isn't very much in ACC, but it could help developers. It could support developers as they are putting together lighting projects. And finally, with all of that in place, doing this on a regular basis, helping build staff underwriting capacity to make sure that, there is the public dollars, the local housing fund dollars are being used to maximize public benefit. And as an example, we just wanted to share, this is not an ACC project. It's actually in Atlanta, a 4% lighting project. You can see that $1.5 million that Invest Atlanta provided in local gap financing was leveraged or is expected to be leveraged 22 times. And that's really the benefit of gap financing is, similarly in Athens, it could allow ACC Gov to leverage its investment. So assuming, going back to this capital stack that we showed for the local housing fund, assuming $2 million on an annual basis, even if it's just a 10x leverage, not 22x, you could attract another $20 million in, public and other public and private capital and developer equity to maximize the impact and build more light-tech units. I'm gonna move on to the next one in case there aren't any questions here. Alrighty. So thinking about the voluntary inclusionary zoning policy, of course, we realize that because it's a voluntary policy and state law prohibits a mandatory IZ policy, there are some limitations in terms of what you can do with it. But again, just based on our conversation with you all last time and looking at the policy, I know there's been some progress on this since we last met, and Alejandra and team would love to hear more from you on that. But one of the things, in terms of what we've seen based on our work in other markets as well is, obviously markets change really quickly. Not just across different cities, but also within across sub-markets within a given city or a given location. And so it's really important to sort of keep going back and reviewing that IZ policy. That is something that we typically recommend in other places we've done this work. And at this point, I think the policy was passed April 2022. So we're a little over a year in, and it would be a good time to revisit, reevaluate the policy and see if the incentives that are offered are still aligned, given the market shifts in this period. And related to that, looking at the unit mix, the required affordability mix, which currently is either 10% of units at 60% or 15% of units at 80% EMI. Is there a case to be made for deeper affordability? Can it really be achieved realistically? And the third thing relates to right now, the policy is focused really on rental housing production, but is there a possibility to align it with for sale homes as well? I think this is something that we heard from you all last time. Again, we've seen this in other markets as well, where we are seeing, there might be already a policy, an IZ policy in place for rental housing, but cities do want to incorporate for sale as well. And then finally, deploying a manual that clearly outlines, what are the guidelines, development approval processes, and monitoring and compliance. And so just, as we think about what are the considerations, what are the components in revisiting this IZ policy, and what should factor in terms of changes, we really look at what, again, like I said, affordability levels, length of affordability, in lieu fee options, looking at the geography, whether there are certain markets, sub-markets within ACC that you want to, or that you can prioritize. And then finally looking at the incentives. What are the appropriate incentives given where the market is today? Is this something you want to revisit in a given period of time? Things like that. And then the table at the bottom, we're just showing essentially where, what it is right now. Like I said, 10% of units at 60% AMI, we're looking at a 100-unit building, 100-unit project here, and seeing the difference in market rent and affordable rent. It's, it clearly incentivizes developers to build the 80% units. But again, the question is, do we want to achieve deeper affordability? And if so, is it possible? How do we do that? I'm going to stop here primarily because I just want to hear from Alejandra and team and anyone else on the latest developments, especially on the IZ piece.
I think what Vinny's referring to is just that the Atlas development out on Lexington Road, that does include some affordable units, but that was approved before the official inclusionary zoning policy came in. And so there is some affordability built in. There's Allura, there's all these mechanisms that will afford, I believe, in 66 units of workforce and affordable homes. So that's a really good example, right, of an early model policy, if you will, that's already in play. And I believe there's a couple of applications in already too, for potentially leveraging the current IZ. Is that what you were referring to, Vinny?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, Vinny, to some degree, it's a little early to tell, to just given its relatively modest level of use. But we're absolutely monitoring how it rolls out. Some of the challenges just have to do with market parameters. For example, if you move from a dynamic of 24 bedrooms per acre to 50 bedrooms per acre, that also almost begins to kick you in many cases into needing structured parking, which is just extremely expensive these days. So I think we're going to have to closely look at these questions. But to your other point about applying this to for sale housing, that's our intent as the next phase.
Right. Thank you. I'm sorry, I couldn't tell who was speaking, but totally agree with you. And I think that's what we heard last time as well, that it's too soon to tell. Absolutely. And, which is why we want to put this in there and, be helpful. And we know that, you all are monitoring it closely and thinking about where this could go, whether it relates to for sale or even for rental units. So hopefully, this is helpful. I'm just curious, you said you're thinking ahead to the next phase. When you say next phase, do you actually have a timeline or something in mind there?
We're in the midst through our planning department of updating our comprehensive land use plan. So really as part of that process, kicking off this summer, but really continuing for probably the next 18 or 24 months, doing it in that time frame.
Okay, got it. Thank you. All righty. I'm going to move on to the last and final tool that we have under this recommendation for rental housing. Like I said, this is really targeted at preserving existing affordable rental housing stock. And what we heard from all of you and, what we're seeing in the data as well is there has been, interest and a loss. There has been market pressure and a loss of at least some naturally occurring affordable housing. And that's really where this recommendation is coming from, to set up an acquisition strike fund. As Philip said, in the beginning, it could actually just be funded through the local housing fund. It needn't be a separate fund, but ideally it would be. And, we're putting a number out there of $5 million. It could be lesser. It's the first step will really be to evaluate one, can you establish a separate strike fund, and two, what is the amount there? So, and what this will do is essentially, actually, I'll go into the next slide, but once that's established, if you do decide that you want to put together an acquisition strike fund, is the question around, similar to the local housing fund, is really determining what are your policy goals with this fund, what are the project types that might be eligible, is it acquisition of what kind of properties, land, things like that. Are there any target geographies? Do you want to target any specific neighborhoods? What are your affordability goals? How deep do you want to go? What are the terms of the financing that this fund will provide? And similar to the local housing fund, engaging both philanthropic partners, but other lending partners as well, banks, CDFIs, as well, to see, what kind of funding they can provide as you build up the capital stack for the strike fund, and to have someone manage the fund, to have a lending partner administer the fund as well. And so, like I said, it's really about identifying, the way it would work is assuming it's a multifamily building or a site in an area that's been designated as a priority area. The developer identifies the opportunity, and through the acquisition, strike fund provides the funding to allow the developer to go acquire that site. And the benefit here is really because oftentimes, especially nonprofit developers may not be able to move as quickly as market rate developers and owners. So it really, the fund allows that quick strike, allows quick acquisition and competing with the market. And once you can decide if, let's say, the money's in there for 3 years or 5 years, when the project is then rolling at the end of the 3 or 5 year period, when the project is rolling over to firm financing, that's when you have your lenders come in. You might have local housing fund money come in as soft debt, most certainly LIHTC equity coming in. And it's really at that stage within that 3 to 5 year period that money goes back to the acquisition strike fund, and it revolves, and it can be put in the next set of deals. And we just wanted to share a quick example from the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, looking first at the capital stack, for the fund itself, where the county and the state provided about 25% of the total funding, and they were able to leverage it 3x to get private funding from banks, from CDFIs, but also philanthropic sources, for a total fund size of about $32.5 million. And the goal, and this fund is targeted primarily at preserving both naturally occurring affordable housing, but also expiring use subsidized buildings. And looking at a specific project example, similar to at the fund level, this was about a 240 unit building. The public subsidy, the fund was able to leverage that 2.5x to get, to include developer equity as well as a traditional first mortgage, and preserve and move pretty quickly to preserve affordability. This was targeted at 60% AMI for 15 years. So that's where we are in terms of the recommendations on rent. I want to stop here before moving on to the home ownership piece. Are there any questions, comments?
I just have one question. In the executive summary, you talk about the average income for households in Athens-Clarke County. But the AMI figure that we've often talked about outside of this is more regional. I'm curious if you have any recommendations about how to hone in on just using one or the other. Where and how we should be kind of keeping that term the same, referring to the same population.
Yeah. So are you referring, Jesse, I think that's you. Are you referring to the use of census numbers versus HUD numbers as it relates to AMI?
Yeah, I mean, in your,
Did we lose sound again?
I can't hear people.
I can't either. Yeah, okay. So Philip, I think this question is around, we went back and forth on this a little bit. The HUD data is for the MSA, whereas ACS data.
Yeah, you got to use the HUD data.
Sorry, we lost sound there, maybe.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, we did.
Did you hear,
The question about using ACS versus HUD data, I think, was like what level, what incomes to use. That was the question. We were talking about how to approach it. Is that right?
essentially, yeah.
So I think that this is something we run into a lot. I think we've talked about some on previous conversations. You need to use HUD data and the regional data from the HUD side for anything you're doing that involves federal funding and frankly a lot of even local funding. That doesn't mean you can't adjust the percentage of AMI lower to reflect the fact that you have deeper levels, you have lower income levels in Athens-Clarke County. When you're talking to the public about this, anything we put in our material, we like to put annual income in there as opposed to AMI, because nobody, even people in our, like us, we do this professionally, do it all the time. I can't off the top of my head tell you 50% AMI for Athens-Clarke County. I do know what $40,000 a year means though. So I think there's a piece for how you're going to design your program. There's a piece for how you're going to talk to the public, and then there's a piece about how low you want to push your income targeting. And the data we put out is, and we saw in your market, like it is the lower income households, and lower incomes because there's lower wages on jobs that have the most need. So that's a partial answer, but maybe not a complete or perfect answer to your question.
For me, that's kind of helpful to think about those different levers. And so, if functionally, given the array of interactions we have with federal government, state government, it just makes practical sense to use area median income. It could also make practical sense for us to say, hey, we're going to target 60% AMI and not so much 80% or above.
Yeah, well, and I guess where it seems especially relevant to me is the AMI figure is so skewed that really like 80% AMI isn't a subsidy at all for someone who lives in Athens. Like it's essentially a subsidy for someone who lives in Oconee. So, I'm just curious if there's a way that this report is going to like very kind of clearly delineate between how the figures are used. It sounds to me like you have that understanding as the author of it. When the average person reads this, it might be pretty hard to delineate between like, well, this page is referring to AMI and this page is referring to average income, and how are those actually distinct terms?
So we can definitely go through and try to make sure that's clear throughout and pull that out. And again, I'm promising you a copy of the report. You all get to review this. We will go through and take that look. If there's places where you think we're missing the point or conflating things, like you won't hurt our feelings. We want to get it right, because it is like I do this professionally and it is confusing for me.
I mean, to me, it seems like something that's been lost, like, to refer to that inclusionary zoning policy as providing a subsidy at all, at the 80% AMI figure, isn't actually providing a subsidy for Athens-Clarke County residents, if that makes sense.
I like your comment when you said you understand what $40,000 is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think Jesse's main concern here is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jesse, is that area median income area is larger than Athens-Clarke County. And because we have some wealthier neighborhoods surround, communities rather, that surround Athens-Clarke County that tends to drive up the AMI versus what would be helpful in Athens-Clarke County alone. And so somewhere maybe in your report, the way to handle this is to have a little section that's AMI, et cetera, and talks about how things are set and how things are looked at nationwide and affordability, but then point out that for the rest of the report, rather than trying to differentiate from between average, AMI, et cetera, that you're going to use just regular numbers, and throughout the rest of the report, use regular numbers. Just like Fred was saying, 40,000. Then when it gets to that point, so that the report is written for the average citizen who doesn't necessarily understand AMI versus average and all the problems with our area versus just Athens-Clarke County. You could create a little few paragraphs that describe that, and then throughout the entire rest of the report, plug in regular real numbers.
Fred, I wanted to hear you finish your thought.
Yeah, he kind of took it up in terms of you use regular numbers because even when you say 40% of, it's like I need a calculator immediately.
Yeah, some people do the math instantly in their head and others don't.
You know, I'm not work with those numbers enough to know. And so when we go out and talk to the public, you know, I'm kind of in this arena. I can imagine there's a communication problem immediately when you start using those terms.
And you can have a policy that's tied to AMI, but then when you go to the public, instead of putting that, every year you go out and you give the dollar numbers that are based on what your policy says, but still are regular numbers for 2023 and then whole numbers for 2024. And then next year in 2025, you publish new numbers, but rather than just having people refer to the federal numbers and try to do the math themselves, just, you know, you can have a policy that's tied to AMI or average or anything, any baseline you choose, but then when you publish it for the public to deal with or for contractors to deal with, stating it in raw dollars.
People generally know what their income is, right? And so immediately they can say, well, that's something that will help me.
Yeah, or I was just outside that number, or I was under that number, or, yeah.
But when you say this, it's almost.
Yeah, you're right.
We will go through the document, we will describe AMIs, and then everything in the document will be used with actual incomes, and we'll put a little footnote about what the AMI is. Like that's for a family of two, this is X AMI, but we will use house annual incomes throughout the document.
And I think to put a finer point on it, I think it'd be helpful if the document says, like, the average income in Athens-Clarke County is blank AMI. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but it doesn't work that way. Like, I can't turn averages into medians, and like, it just doesn't translate the way you're asking me to translate it. I can say incomes are lower in Athens-Clarke County than the AMI, but I can't do a one-for-one translation or a percentage translation. The data just doesn't work that way. I can say it's lower. I can't tell you it's 30% lower.
All right.
All right. So yeah, so we can, and you know, like Caleb said, we'll mention, I think we were careful about mentioning both percent AMI and income, but we'll look out for that and make sure we're specifying income throughout the report going forward. All right, I'm going to move on to the next set. I'm sorry, someone saying something?
No, go ahead.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next set of recommendations as it relates to both new homeowners as well as existing homeowners. So we're talking about, you know, a down payment assistance program. These are both actually programs that HCD is currently moving on with ARPA funding that they have, and there's an RFP out there for it. And of course, HCD, along with its nonprofit partners, has already been running, these programs with CDBG and home funding previously as well. And so the down payment assistance program is really about helping new homeowners or households looking to enter the home ownership market. And the second one around owner-occupied repair programs is for existing homeowners to keep homes habitable, allow them, especially senior households, for instance, to age. So when we talk about, and both of these programs, like we suggested earlier, we're looking at it through the local housing. So when we talk about the down payment assistance program, low and moderate income households, and the first step would be to identify, okay, what are the program objectives? What are the parameters? What is the level of assistance that can be provided? What is the form of assistance? It's a grant or a loan, and depending on how it's structured, it can really it could either be emphasizing long-term affordability, or it could be about prioritizing wealth building. If it's a grant, if it's a forgivable loan, it's really focused more on wealth building, versus if it's a repayable loan, either in part or in whole, it helps to preserve that affordability in the long term for subsequent homeowners as well. And when we, again, we've seen this in other places as well, and this is what we recommend, is in addition to providing to maximize the impact of a down payment assistance program, it's actually worth tying it in, aligning it with other products out there. So for instance, we recommend HCD work with CRA motivated lenders, look at the products that they are offering, and how the DPA product here, the program here, can actually support that and magnify the impact. And the other piece of it, as it relates to aligning the DPA program with other services, is really looking at home buyer counseling, which we know that your current and proposed DPA programs already do. But that's really, it does go, it's a very key component of providing down payment assistance. And, it needs to go hand in hand, home buyer counseling, asset building counseling, especially for first-time home buyers. And once all of that is identified, HCD, ACC Gov can start operating a competitive process on an annual basis, taking from the processes currently in place to deploy funding. And to provide an example, we're looking at, let's say, a home purchase price of almost $300,000. Again, I realize I'm looking at this slide, given the conversation we just had, this says 80% AMI. But, looking at what is it, combining the local DPA with other possible DPA programs. So whether that's, the DCA, the Georgia Department of Community Affairs DREAM program, which does provide $10,000 for down payment assistance, and really layering this program to, again, leverage its impact in, providing, say, $35,000 in funding per household can help, and putting in a total of $1 million from the local housing fund could support 30 to 35 new homeowners every year. And the second recommendation here, as it relates to owner-occupied repair, again, this is something that ACC Gov has already been doing and is deploying more funding towards it. But one of the things that we're putting forward for consideration is, based on our conversations with all of you over the last few months, is one, expanding the funding per unit, but two, also expanding the total funding pool for owner occupied repair. And this is, like I said, coming from our assessment of the projects you've been doing and our conversations with you. As we understand it, the current program is structured as a grant, and the average grant amount has been about $9,000. And while that includes administrative costs, and that does help, there is a need for larger scale repairs which cost more than $9,000. And we know that ACD is currently in the process of revising that and providing up to $80,000 in forgivable loans. But the only thing to consider here is, and that again, we've gone into more detail on this in the report, is whether, it's structured as a grant or a loan, and up to what amount, just because when you look at the administrative complexity involved with administering a loan, do you want to increase the grant amount to, I don't know, $10,000, $15,000, something like that, going beyond the current limit. And then the second recommendation, the second step here is to identify additional funding sources. Currently, you're using CDBG, ARPA, and you're planning to use home funding for this as well. But again, that's federal money, comes with strings attached. And being able to deploy local money through the local housing fund can help reduce some of those administrative costs. And then, of course, one of the things that we're looking at actively, this is back to federal funding and therefore strings attached, but is the Inflation Reduction Act money coming down the pike, especially as it relates to energy efficiency upgrades that can be layered in here as well. And finally, looking at your existing and your upcoming program support for owner-occupied rehab, we recommend ACC Gov work with its nonprofit partners to finalize the program design, working with code enforcement, other stakeholders, and can determine what are the program goals, what's the targeting, and finalize the program design. Here, and I talked through this already, but when we talk about specifically increasing the grant amount per household, like I said, currently the average funding per project is about $8,800, including administrative costs. And it provides money essentially to make some small scale repairs. But there could be a case made for, or there is a need for larger scale repairs, longer lasting repairs. And the question here is, one, what is that maximum amount per project? And two, whether that's structured as a grant or a loan, and what are the thresholds for that? So, $10,000 is not a hard and fast number here. It could be a little more as well, but we're putting it out here for your consideration and for discussion. And I think that is it. I'm going to stop here. Philip, did you want to add anything before we go into discussion?
We're good. Interested in feedback and comments.
So I have a question. The last slide mentioned the current average funding amount per project is $8,000. Where? Where is that? In Athens-Clarke County? Nationally?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Athens-Clarke County, yes.
That does include administrative costs. So this is not straight up like how much it costs to actually fix a bathroom, right? It includes whatever admin costs it takes Habitat or ALT to make it happen.
So does that include not only funds that are directed by the unified government, like in things like Hands on Athens, but does that include like Action Incorporated administration of those activities too?
If they're, Biddy, correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, so if Action or Habitat or ALT are doing any sort of rehab project, that includes the administrative input. Because yes, I know, and I know where you're going, because typically we have the actual amount of dollars agencies can actually invest in any single property to Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that set by HUD? Is that set by Athens-Clarke County? Because these are CDBG monies. Who sets those caps?
My recollection is that that was set a long time ago with the thought that as you moved above about $5,000, you began to get into other kind of remediation requirements around things like lead paint. And I don't know if there's some other motivators currently, but this is back out 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, and let me clarify, we're saying average, and yet average implies that it's significantly more than that to get down to the average, because some are gonna be less than the average and some are gonna be more than the average. But it almost sounds to me like you're saying that that's the max, not the average. So if there's a max of 5, then that's not the average, that's the max.
Yeah,
Or
I believe.
that's an average of the amount above 5,000 that includes that some programs are gonna charge more than $3,800 to administer and some are gonna charge less than $3,800. But on average, there's $3,800 worth of administration in the deal. Because if the on the ground end of the unit is maxed at 5,000, then that's more like a max than an average of 8,800.
So, like, just the vast majority of the rehabs that are happening at the small interior around the $5,000. There are some exceptions that go higher. Your administrative costs relative to your dollars going into buildings is excessively high. Your program needs to be.
That's what it looks like to me. If it's 5,000, there's $3,800. That's
generally
a
right.
huge
Yes.
percentage of the dollars that are going into the ground in order to get those dollars onto the ground.
That's correct. There is a problem here about the scale of, like, there needs to be more dollars going into the bricks and sticks and on a per unit basis, and there needs to be administrative costs. Maybe there's cuts in administrative costs, but the ratio has to be brought.
Yeah, clearly one of the biggest single problems you've got is people who can't afford to put on a new roof. There's no way you're getting a new roof for $5,000.
Right, and I will, and Roger or Margaret, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about, how we're trying to update that policy within HCD, because, to Mayor's point, that 5,000 limit was set a while ago, and I know 5,000 barely buys a ramp, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's lumber.
So I'll pass it to Margaret or Roger if you want to share a little bit, if not, I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure. So HCD has taken a look at our current rehab policy regarding grant funding, CDBG and home. And so we have revised our policy to try to allow for more funding for owner rehab projects. We started that with the ARPA dollars, as there were 3 or 2 projects for homeowner rehab, 2. And so some of the changes that we're looking at, obviously, we had the $5,000 cap, as Mayor Gertz mentioned, for CDBG. We're also looking to expand that on the CDBG side up to $40,000. Now, there will be a forgivable loan component tied to that. And this is, all across the nation, as you go higher up with grant subsidy, there has to be some affordability attached to that, so that someone doesn't take $50,000 and rehab and then flip the house. Right. So we're looking at that. We also have extended home dollars for rehab as well. The affordability periods on the higher end would be 15 years in most cases. And then for ARPA funds, basically theirs is from 5,000 to 80,000. But the $80,000 are for qualified census tracts. So we have been working to revise that policy so that we are in a better position during the CDBG funding cycle or home funding cycle to make more funds available.
So how long?
I certainly hear the concern about flipping. I would encourage you to not prioritize that as your primary concern. you want to invest in your stock and improve the stock regardless. If a low-income family sells the house and then buys a different house, it's a good quality house, and they were able to do that because of the investment you made in the house, you still helped that family have a good place to live, and you still improved your housing stock. You should have some concern about that, but would encourage you to not make that your primary focus.
Yeah, I think that's just for very specific ARPA programs, Philip, so it's very specific.
Yeah, I don't think we would make it a priority, but in Athens, there's a lot of investment properties
Yeah.
and they're flipped.
It's part of, I mean, it's part of the context, being in a college town.
Yeah, so that policy, like, we're still refining that, but the idea is that that would impact the CDBG and home cycles that will be, I believe those RFPs will be coming out in the fall.
You know, one way you might look at, as I sit here, just a light bulb went off, one way you might be able to solve that problem is saying just that it has to be owner occupied. And that if you sell it, it has to be owner occupied or you owe the money back. If you sell it to somebody who then's gonna rent it, that's what you worry about on flipping is that they're gonna sell it. And as just pointed out by our consultants, you know, you wanna build family wealth and you want them to be able to leverage that family wealth into a better life for them. But on the other hand, you don't want windfalls and you certainly don't want flipping out to third-party investors. And so it might be that you might be able to write your legal documents in such a way that, you know, it has to be owner occupied to qualify, obviously, but then the secondary buyer, if they do it, sell it within X period of time, must be an owner occupant as well. And otherwise, those dollars then become repayable so that you're not. So that might be a sort of a hybrid that addresses concerns of our consultants while also addressing the unique concerns in Athens-Clarke County's market.
Yeah, because parallel with some of the earlier comments from HRNA about the loss of naturally occurring rental housing, we've also had a loss of naturally occurring ownership stock. If you look at the arc of the last few years, you know, there are any number of places, you know, Fred, you could probably name it block by block, where, you know, at one point you had multi-generational family home ownership, and you know, you've seen kind of the investor class heavily moved into those neighborhoods. You know, East Athens, Newtown, something we could go on.
Yeah, and there's also a possibility of making that second buyer also qualify, right? Like if they also are within whatever that percentage MI is, then, you know, that loan could potentially be forgiven, because again, you're still allowing them to build generational wealth, but you're also helping that next family.
How does, I know the government wheels move slowly, how can this process be expedited? And you referenced the revised policy is in the works. I know the ARPA, you mentioned, or someone mentioned 2 ARPA options for home repairs, but that money still is not out. Because of whatever reason, safety and risk or whatever it is.
There's a lot of engagement right now with safety and risk and finance and the attorney's office in getting that contracting process winnowed down. And it's, you know, and it doesn't matter whether you do homeownership activity, development, or you know, whether you're building new sales out there, it's been an extended process. I think everybody recognizes that. So there's a lot of work. Assistant Manager Jones and Andrew Williams are working on that project.
Yeah, and it seems that this is a recurring thing that at least I hear about talking to other nonprofits, that the money gets awarded, but it takes so long through this kind of funding process to get it in the hands of the nonprofits.
Yeah.
To Mayor's point, that is a process we're trying to streamline. We're also at ACD, we're moving into an online system whereby even the RFP applications, it's going to be much more streamlined. It'll be more of an online component. Of course, we'll provide TA as needed, but that will also help us make sure that we have everything up front so that in the contracting phase, once the award is made, we just move like this or as quickly as we can. But to your other point too, so we do have an RFP currently out right now. That's for the Athens Justice and Memory Project. That's a total of 1.25 million of ARPA dollars for down payment assistance and homeowner occupied That closes on September 1st. And then the other awards that have already been made for rehab and also for new construction, that does include this new limit.
Yeah, and the awards have been made, but the money is not.
It's not out yet.
Yeah.
We're getting through.
Yeah.
Yes. Whereas we're wanting to get that done as much as you do, believe us.
And I'm sure the HRA folks, I mean, just in your consulting capacity of just seeing around the country, you know, as ARPA dollars are out there, you know, local governments, cities and counties, you know, have struggled, you know, both on the staffing end, just like every employer has, but then you're trying to administer so many more programs and activities with those employees.
Yeah, I mean, more funding takes more work to put it out. It takes more capacity to do. But the nice thing we've seen in this other places is also a chance as you pour more funding in to revisit programs that you designed and probably designed appropriately 10, 15 years ago, and it's time to revisit and make adjustments. We're doing some work in Chattanooga, which is, you know, going through their ARPA money and doing some similar things. They're updating and revising their down payment assistance program, making sure they have larger amounts of funding, and frankly, they do a better job in outreach. There's some real disparities in who they've been reaching out to. And then revising their owner-occupied rehab program. They had a program that was just focused on roofs, and they think it's great. They haven't been able to scale it up. So then really going and looking at like what the real needs are and how to do it. And they have some of the same pressure about a lot of investor activity in their market and how to make sure that they're putting large amounts of money out because it takes large amounts of money to improve the quality of the home. And then have protections to make sure it stays homeowner. Yeah, but this is definitely a challenge. Like, you are not alone. It is, you know, federal money isn't easy to work with, and particularly single family level, so owner occupied rehab or down payment assistance. It's a lot of touch points to make it work. You know, Sophie and Austin have done a good job of pulling in a bunch of case studies about how other places have approached this. You know, obviously every place is different, and you got to acknowledge your local context. But there are other communities who've set up systems and programs and have grappled with some of these administrative cost issues and some of these scales issues and some of the making sure they're using public money the most effectively. So, you know, I think we give you something to work from, but it is real work. I mean, that's just the truth. It's significant work.
What other comments do y'all have on all the strategies presented? Any questions on implementation? Again, this is not your last chance, but this is a good discussion opportunity.
Philip, in the summary we were sent, you mentioned that, of course, this is happening concurrent with the work through the Cloudburst group around homelessness. Will in the bigger document, you be recommending any set aside designation or priority for rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing or anything else, or are you kind of letting the Cloudburst report fly the flag there?
We are deferring that. We are acknowledging very clearly that homelessness is part of the housing strategy, and then deferring to them on what they're recommending. We put forward some general priorities about depth of income. So the conversation we're having about the fact that incomes are lower in Athens-Clarke County. We put forward some recommendations about the depth of income, but we didn't put recommendations about home ownership versus rental versus homelessness, because it does need to be, one, it depends on how much money, and two, it depends on what comes out of their report.
Right. And
Yeah.
to that point, so sorry, Asia.
So I was just going to add to that Alejandra and the team did facilitate a couple of conversations between us and the Cloudburst team, which were really helpful. And what we came out of that with was, we're going to reference, we have some sense what recommendations they're making, and we'll make reference to that in the report, and I think vice versa as well. But like Philip said, we are not going into any level of detail on the homelessness piece in our report.
Right. So essentially, both reports do cross-reference each other. We're also our team is coming up with basically probably a two-pager at this point that very clearly maps out those points of connections with page numbers and everything, right? So for example, here, the housing plan is talking about the local housing fund. American, you all could decide that that could also potentially help fund rapid rehousing down the line, right? So that could be a potential point of connection. So that is part of our assignment as well, to make it really clear to plans kind of collide, or not collide, but work with each other. So you will have that. That's not quite ready yet. They're still finalizing homelessness, but Mayor and Commission will have that document as leading up to the votes, as well as the public leading up to throughout all the public input process. Next few weeks.
To that, my understanding is the timing's slightly staggered, like one of these is gonna run through about a month before the other. Why not put them on the same timeline, even if it means making one wait a month?
So
Give it one more time, just so that we're all reading all the same
Yeah.
stuff at the same time.
we considered doing both public input processes at the same time, housing and homelessness, but there's so much to each plan that we just felt it was gonna cause way too much confusion with the public to try to differentiate what belongs, like even this meeting conversation, right? Like what is included in the homelessness plan versus what's included in the housing plan. And so it is staggered, but just by a month. So this kind of segues a little bit into the next point. If you look at this that you'll have, it's just kind of the schedule of our affordable housing plan input process. So it'll start on August 7th and basically close with the Mayor Commission vote on September 5th. So we're gonna have the website's gonna be updated with the final plan. We're gonna have a one-sheeter both in English and Spanish. We're gonna have an online input form / survey for anyone who wants to just submit their written comments. We're gonna have 3 community forums. We're really intentional in picking even the times and the locations. So we'll be on the West side, we're at the ACC Extension Office. We'll be at the Triangle Plastic Resource Center on East Athens. We'll be at the library, which is a little more central. And then, of course, the public can always go into the agenda setting and voting sessions to provide input there, which I'm expecting there will be.
They do come downtown.
Yes, and so basically, as soon as this kind of phases off, Jesse, like within, I think there's about a week or 2 overlap when the homelessness process, which basically mirrors the same number of events, same activities, will kick off. So it'll be up to, so right now the schedule is housing plan and environment commission September 5th, homelessness on October 3rd. It'll be up to the mayor and commission if they want to delay the vote.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing that's sticking out to me. It's like for final adoption to happen at the same time, even though what you're saying about
That's
stagger.
within your purview to decide as commissioners if you want to wait to fully vote on it on October 3rd, but that's the plan. And again, it was mostly because we do want to separate it. Like it's confusing sometimes even for us and for some of our nonprofit partners. Even just in developing plans, it's a lot of confusion about what we were talking about. So that was the strategy.
Respectfully, we need flexibility.
Yeah. Anything else? No. Yes, you'll just love it. Great. Minor changes. Okay, so while everybody went through this, we don't have quorum for the April 4th minutes approval, so we'll just have to wait for the next round.
Can I ask one more question? I've got them here.
Yes, of course.
Are your recommendations going to include some amount of detailed analysis on what to change in our inclusionary zoning policy?
Yes, but
Like, it seems clear that you think we need to revisit it and probably revise it at some point, but will there be like specifics, like what language to change or what section to modify or add or?
So we get more specific than what you're saying here. We talk about some of the AMI mixes, but we are not recommending that you revise it yet because for exactly the reasons that have been said, like it's new and the market has just shifted in a very, very major way. So we're not like, we haven't done the analysis, like 1, we wouldn't necessarily do those changes yet. And 2, we haven't done the analysis of running financial models for all the different developments that are going on, which is would need to be pretty extensive to make, okay, you should raise density by this much because you won't run into, but not more than that because you'll run into construction changes, or you should do this, you should blend the affordability rates as opposed to having them all be at 60%. we certainly can do that kind of stuff. We would recommend you wait a little bit and look at it. We recommend you wait a little bit and look at it. And then if you want to do that kind of analysis, you need to get into the numbers of the deals pretty deeply to actually have a concrete set of recommendations.
Related to that, this is Matt Hall from the Planning Commission. The analysis you gave with the little table about how 10% of units at 60% of AMI, there's this much lost rent, and 15% at 80%, there's this much lost rent. We're all premised on the average market rate of 1,766 for a 2-bedroom apartment. But I think that, and I'm sure you know, like brand new units are not built at the average. But, 2 bedrooms in brand new developments are not offered at 1,766. They're typically 2,000, 2,100, 2,200 in recent developments. And I think that would alter your analysis significantly. And I wanted to just suggest, to the extent you're putting stuff about that in there, that you take account of what new units cost rather than using the misleading market average for all existing units.
So Austin, do you want to speak to the units we use? I believe you said we used closer things to market rate to new construction. So you want to speak to that?
Yeah, when we used those estimates, we looked at the 5 or 6 most recently delivered units within Clarke County to give that kind of median estimate. Now that's also, there are some caveats there where it's the median between all units. So 2 and 3 bedroom units might run more, and studios and single bedroom units might run less. And so it's not a perfect estimate, but we were looking at units delivered in 21 and 22. Obviously the market's continuing to shift. So, it could be even more now if we update the numbers again.
Did you say you used new units delivered in Clarke and Oconee? Did I hear that right?
No, just Clarke County.
Okay.
One, we want to make sure it's accurate. We're happy to send the list of developments we use. If you think you're using wrong numbers, we don't want to, we don't want to mislead. We want to use the actual numbers. So we're happy to send over our numbers and the projects we pulled from. And if we should be looking at other projects, we're happy to adjust.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to add one thing for Commissioner Hall. So with the inclusionary zoning ordinance, there are some revisions that are coming forward. I believe Solomon Smothers in our office, the housing coordinator, has taken the lead on that, but he has submitted edits to the mayor's inclusionary zoning housing group. And they have reviewed those edits and will be forwarding those edits to the planning department for review and approval. I think Attorney Hines also reviewed some of those suggestions. I don't think it's anything significant other than just clarity in the ordinance. There were some things I think Andrew Saunders, when he was interim director, pointed out that needed to be updated. And so assuming that the planning department or planning commission approves those changes, then that will go before the mayor. But I just wanted to bring that to the table. Did you stop one?
Yeah, and one more, it's page 19 of the document we were sent, I guess, the draft. You have this chart of basically what cost burden is defined as. And I noticed that utilities was left out of that, and I'm just curious, I've heard the 30% figure refer to rent, and I've heard it referred to for rent and utilities. And then I noticed on here, you have residual income, you list things like food, childcare, medical, and transportation. I'm just curious, where would utilities fall? Is that
utilities are part of your housing cost?
So it should be rent and utilities essentially on that?
Housing cost, yes.
Okay. Would it be possible to modify that to clarify that? I think because I've had confusion about that. I think there's often confusion about that.
Big question for the public.
Yeah. And certainly if we're talking to a developer about what they're going to charge someone in rent, they wouldn't charge $875 in rent if someone's supposed to be spending $875 in rent and utilities. They'd have to, unless they're paying for all their utilities. Right?
That's
It's just a
correct.
matter of changing the label on that,
Yeah, that was,
to rent and utilities.
what page was that?
Page 19, and I mean, that also relates to our inclusionary zoning, right? I mean, if we're allowing people to charge a certain amount of rent and not looking at utilities, we're actually not hitting people at as much of a subsidy as we're imagining we are.
I think we've got that addressed in the ordinance, don't we? Isn't there, I'm looking at Matt because he was on the committee with me that made his recommendations, but, and maybe, Quita knows more since you work on the revisions, but I think that we don't, there's language in the ordinance that
I can't remember the
requires.
language well.
Oh, of course, Rick was on that too.
Yeah, but I can't
Yeah.
remember.
I think there is something in there. I don't have it right now.
And I remember Heather was the one that was able to give us some good insight on,
Yeah.
like what kind of, to index that to.
I do have Solomon's edits right here, and it does define affordable rent to, 30%, blah, 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 less a reasonable allowance for utilities. So it does take account of that. And
So this is.
I'm not sure if that's an edit that Solomon is adding, or if that's something that's in the original ordinance. I think it's in the original ordinance.
So we'll just update this, is what you're just speaking to, right?
Basically, yeah.
Basically say rent and utility, somehow make it clear.
For the utilities, I think it's the clearest one.
Okay.
Was that, when Philip said housing costs though, are we talking about 30% of housing costs as the target, or are we
30%.
30% of income?
Income. The rent and utility should not be more than
30%
30%
of the income, but
Yeah.
when he said housing costs, I just wanted, we were saying rent and utilities, but there are other housing costs associated with that. So I just
That's right.
wanted to be clear that, if we should say, other options to include the housing costs.
So define what housing cost really is.
Right.
And label that maybe as housing costs.
Yeah.
Define it.
Like maybe mapping out which utilities count and which don't.
Yeah.
And then also like, if when we say reasonable allowance, if there is some kind of estimate on what a reasonable amount is.
That's really hard to do because it varies by bedroom size, the number of people in the household. You'd have to have a whole huge table. You could pull that from DCA, but it's not a simple answer. It's entirely dependent on size of the household and what mix of utilities you have. You have all gas for heating and water heating and cooking, or, so it's, when you start talking about utility allowances, it gets.
But it'd be good, I think, for us to have that somehow clarified or at least referenced in here. Because ultimately, if what we're trying to do is build a policy, and what we and certainly the average person is gonna be looking at is just a hard number of this is what I should expect to have to pay.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have to expect to pay $875 in rent. I should expect to pay much less than $875 in rent, so I still get money for water and electricity, right? So, anyway, just, if there's a way around
That
that.
is what the policies all say, just to be clear, like, we're happy to modify the document, but that is what it all says. Like the actual recommendations, that's all monitored and set up in the affordability clauses. Or anything, like if you do a tax credit development, that's all, it's set in there. The utility allowances
Yeah,
are built into the rents.
you do that, it's set in there, and it's varies depending on what utilities you are supplying for that particular development. Because
Yeah.
like I said, it varies on the dollar cost varies based on what utilities you use.
We'll update the chart to make sure we're showing utilities in there, and we can do a median or an average utility number as a placeholder and acknowledge it varies, based on the house's insulation, whether it's gas, whether it's electric. You don't have to get into, we don't need a full chart. We can just say, it's around $150 a month, so back $150 out of this. So not
Just
75.
find that exact number and coming up with an
No,
exact.
that's fine. I just think what he said was.
That has a utility schedule model online.
Yeah, I think that's what, I want to go back and look at the inclusionary zoning ordinance now, but I really think we referenced either that or DCA's in the ordinance. Because we didn't want to leave any sort of, well, what do you think is average?
Right, it's easier to just reference DCA.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, even though that's statewide, but nonetheless, it's a good proxy. and it's out there and they update it, stable.
We all have the same, or most of us have the same electricity provider.
If you're Jimmy Carter and you put on that sweater in the winter and you keep your thermostat at 58, here's where you'll be.
Yeah, so if there's no other questions, basically next steps is we're gonna get the full final draft, if you will, from HRNA early mid next week, right? Is that still, we're still on track? At which point we will send it to you all. So you can start reviewing it. And again, our public input process starts right away because we gotta get it in.
And these are hard dates at this point, is that correct?
They are hard dates.
Okay.
So I
So
can,
these are dates I can put into my calendar and they're not likely to change.
unless something happens.
I understand.
But they are as hard as they can
Nothing in
get.
life is certain. I get it. I get it. But
They're as solid as they could get. And yeah, we'll include all those materials as well, because we do want all your help in getting as many residents out for this as possible. So, anything else from anybody on screen or live person? No. All right. Well, thank you again. We'll adjourn at 11:55. Thank you, HRNA team. I'm sure we will talk. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Appreciate the
Thank you so
feedback
much.
and,
Thanks, everyone.
We'll try to incorporate everything.